Business engagement, and also a lot of companies establishing itself in Africa. We also have seen this as an important part of the new growth that we're seeing in Africa. 6 of the 10 fastest global economies are now in Africa, and this is partly due to the great interest and investment from the private sector. It's not only due to ODA, development assistance, but when you can combine development assistance being an incentive, a real incentive for unlocking private sector investments, then you're in a win-win situation, and you see growth, investments, and real poverty eradication.
How can the Norwegian government encourage more and better business between Norway and Africa?
It's already staggering results in this area. We have seen a growth in Norwegian investments in Africa that has been considerable. We know there are a lot of Norwegian companies now investing in Africa, and if you can combine that real interest in Africa in different sectors, and not only in the natural resources sectors, but also in a broad context, then there is a win-win situation. It's good for the Norwegian companies, but it's also extremely good for those companies that, or those countries that will see these investments.
Past decade, how do you see Nigerian experiences compared to how Africa is moving forward?
Well, it's actually symptomatic of what's happening across the continent. Basically, improvements in democracy, the transitions to civilian rule, the demilitarization of politics, a focus on governance and transparency, and the centrality of the economy to government policy. Obviously, it's a country of 167 million people, and there's a whole legacy of decades of military rule, decades of stifled reforms, and therefore we probably moved at a pace that may not be as fast as we would have liked to. But if you look at what's happened with the power reforms, for example, of recent, and the privatization of the power sector, power generation and distribution, if you look at what's happening with the agricultural transformation initiatives, and what we've done with, say, fertilizer subsidies and value chains, and if you look at the progress that's been made, which we still have to conclude on passing the petroleum industry bill to bring investments into the upstream and downstream and midstream, then you would say that that reform is taking off.
You were talking about where African businesses can compete with the rest of the world. Can you say something about that?
Well, the critical thing is to recognize that Africa is a very big market. It's basically the world's second largest continent. It's 54 different countries, but it's really they're all contiguous. They're not divided by huge mountain ranges, and although there is a big desert, obviously, in the north. But apart from that, the movement of goods, infrastructure, connectivity, the movement of capital shouldn't be a problem. So if you think of Africa as the market, and you're not trying to compete with the Asians in selling to Europe and America, but basically bring production and manufacturing to Africa, that is, I think, where the great potential lies for Africa.
How was your work being done by when you were cleaning up the finance sector in Nigeria?
I mean, it's just important to just have clarity of what needed to be done. First of all, obviously the institutions were the most important. It was important to provide the liquidity support to make sure the banks didn't collapse, and then to bring in the capital, which we did with the Asset Management Corporation of Nigeria, cleaned up the toxic assets, brought in capital, and then imposed on the banks the cost of cleanup. So every Nigerian bank is going to make a contribution for the next 10 to 15 years that will basically pay the cost of the banking system bailout. But it's also important to us that individuals had to take responsibility for what they did. And where we found that this was not a simple issue of external shocks, but really individuals taking action for their own selfish profit interests that place deposits at risk. We brought them to trial before courts of law. Not so much because, first because there are lines that can be crossed, but for a much bigger picture, which is to clean up the image of the industry as one that's fraught with corruption and where anything goes, and also make it clear to CEOs coming after them that there would be a day of reckoning if they cross certain lines.
What advice would you like to give to Norway businesses who wants to invest in Africa?
My advice for Norwegian businesses to invest and enter into those markets is to look for local partners that that understand the markets well and can guide them in expanding their business there. Generally, finding a partner is always a challenge. So, in Norway you have what we refer to as NOFAM, the Norwegian Foreign Affairs Ministry's investment arm. So they are good partners. I mean, they have been our partners for the last 10-15 years. So I think if you find parties like that who have access to people who operate in those markets like us and many others, could provide them that access point and be not only just introduce partners, but can also play a long-term role in investing with them.
When you invest in an African country, how do you identify and overcome different barriers?
Well, I think each country is different in the continent, and each issues vary by degree. Some are more magnified than the other. So having local teams that are well trained and educated overseas, have come back after 20 years ago, are good people to start off with. So we have built a network in the market over 20 years. So our teams have been there since 93, 94, and we started off in the hard way as ourselves in the 90s, and now we are one of the most experienced and successful investors in that market. So first of all, go with someone who knows what they're doing and learn the ropes, and after that, if you want to do it on your own, by all means, but find a partner who has already done it.
From your point of view, which sectors do you think is the best to invest in?
There are 3 or 4 sectors, I think, that we are seeing that has enormous growth and a lot of activities. One is financial services, and that includes banks, insurance, leasing, and the likes. And that is starting to get a lot of momentum. A lot of investments are going into it, and that, I think, is a great place to invest. Healthcare is another place. I think there's a lot of investments that can be made as well. Then you have logistics, because as the infrastructure grows and there's a lot more trade, logistics becomes a key part of that whole infrastructure. Then, of course, you have what a great need today in Africa is power. And a lot of the countries are reforming the power regulations and allowing private sector to move into it. So we see that's another huge area for investment that one can invest in. But that's more with the private-public partnership model, in essence, and that. Companies are focused on fast-moving consumer goods. The whole middle class and the consumption, which is taking hold. So that's another place to invest.
Norway, the biggest barrier is the perception of Africa. The perception being far too pessimistic and far too much sort of colored by the past, troubled past, but not really seeing the opportunities that are unfolding. High economic growth, political stability, corruption far less of a problem than many other places in the world. So it's much more an attractive place to be as an investor than people think of.
Sure. What kind of advice would you give to Norwegian investors who are thinking of investing in African countries?
Well, that's a bit depending on who you are. I mean, are you an industrial company wanting to set up a subsidiary, or a financial investor? So I think that depends very much on who you are. Of course, the general advice is make sure that you have partners that understand the local terms and conditions, the culture. So partners, to me, or at least in our strategy, I mean, the most important thing we do is really choosing the partner. So partner, I would say. And I think that's also the case for other investors.
When foreign investors go into African countries and want to invest, does that also follow with some sort of responsibility?
Well, like every place else in the world. I mean, as an investor, you should be a responsible investor. That's no different in Africa than in Asia, than in Eastern Europe or Norway. I mean, so there's nothing particular about Africa.
What kind of sectors do you see as growth sectors in the coming 10-20 years in Africa?
Energy that we are in, banking sector, financial institution will grow rapidly over the next few decades. And then what is in English called fast-moving consumer goods, food and other sort of products that consumers, the rapidly growing middle class, would like to buy and consume.
And with your background from emerging markets, how do you see Africa going for the next 10 years?
So I'll answer your question on the basis you call emerging markets growth markets, because that's where the opportunity is. Africa's trajectory going forward is actually enormous. Obviously there are challenges, obviously there can be slowdowns, but on the whole, the story is a positive one because Africa has made the transition towards governing itself. Africa has made a transition towards a consumption-driven story that is being driven by resources, but at the same time, the human resource story in Africa is enormous. The opportunity that comes from a young population, a middle class that is growing, and therefore more consumption, more opportunity for investment.
You were talking about that Africa is ultra-local. What do you mean by that?
There are 50 countries in Africa, and those 50 countries collectively represent very diverse cultures, very diverse ethnicities, and a different way of governing almost. So when I say ultra-local, you cannot possibly have a presence in one country that can reflect the cultural nuances of another. You have to really know the country in which you're investing and be a part of it domestically.
You were talking about why private investments are so important and not just other types of development. Why is this?
Well, private investments are important for the one very simple reason that they reach into parts of the economy that the public markets don't reach. So the point that I was making earlier about the fact that public markets are very shallow, and 5 companies in each of the 5 top markets dominate 50% of the local stock exchange, right? That does not lead to a representative sample of how the economy is doing. And therefore, private companies, by definition, if you invest in them, you'll be able to get a far greater sense of the growth of the economy, the creativity, the productivity, etc.
How can private investments and better economies, how does this benefit the whole population and not just the top people in the business?
Well, because the private sector almost by definition invests in sectors that are the greatest contributors to GDP and not necessarily in the ones that result in the greatest earnings to the state. So the resources sector is one where you don't have a lot of job creation, you have a lot of specialization, and it doesn't lead to the enhancement of a stakeholder system. Whereas what the private sector does through investment, especially if it does so in a responsible manner, in an inclusive manner, is going to result in businesses that create jobs that have a knock-on impact throughout the stakeholder community in which they operate.
To have any good advice for Norwegian companies who want to invest in Africa?
Find the right local partners, understand the local landscape, invest with disciplined thinking, and expect the returns that are commensurate with that market on a consistent basis. Don't look for the big wins, don't look for the quick wins, and invest with managers that know where to look and how to invest.
The first thing, well, this over 2 decades, it is in between 25 years now. The first thing what I was flabbergasted is that an African is like a sponge. He wants to know everything, and he's going to try it out. So if you compare that to a Norwegian, or maybe I don't know Norwegian, but to a Dutch person or to Dutch persons, they will maybe also absorb knowledge and competencies, but to try it out is a completely different chapter. What I notice with Africans is that they don't have this big resistance to change. What we in Holland have. If you want to change something in Holland, we prefer to stick to the routine, where an African wants to try it out, and that is fantastic, especially when you train Africans. It's fantastic to see them afterwards in the practice. They are great to train, and they are great appliers.
One of the biggest challenges we have as Africans is that the perception of Africa around the world is completely convoluted. And the Africa that we live in and the Africa that we see is not the same Africa that the rest of the world sees. Unfortunately, over the years, the West has grown to love hating Africa. And the net result has been that Africa's got a very bad name and a very bad reputation. And we spend a lot of time dispelling those myths and convincing people that the risks in Africa are no bigger or less than the risks anywhere else in the world. So my Africa is definitely a lot different from the Africa that a lot of outsiders see.
You said something that has been, maybe it was a bit controversial earlier, Africa for Africans.
I'm a great believer in the fact that Africa is for Africans. I'm a great believer in the fact that the future of Africa is going to depend on Africans themselves losing this perception that they are less than anybody else in the world. And this is one of the biggest changes that's happened in Africa in the last 5 or 10 years, is that Africans are starting to believe in themselves. And in the past, Africa was a location that foreign investors could invest in order to extract our resources and our raw materials. Today's Africa is very different. Today, the opportunities for investors are as big, if not bigger, than they've ever been before. But the opportunities are different. The opportunities are to invest with Africans, to support Africans, to grow businesses that are going to make money for everybody. And that's the reality of what I mean by Africa for Africans.
What's really important about where Africa is 2 things. One is that the scale has really shifted in its favor, in that the world is now, for the first time, starting to look at Africa as a partner, and starting to look at Africa for its potential rather than its negatives. So we're moving, and this is now in full swing. I mean, I would argue Norway is maybe the last bastion of the old way of looking at Africa, which is aid, and charity and relief. And even in Norway now, that narrative is dying. And that is a really important shift for Africa. The second really important shift for Africa is the level, the maturity of debate. So one thing that's really good is that people are quite honest in their discussion of what is going on in Africa, and that I think is a really important part of informing people, investor communities in countries like Norway and the many other countries around the world that are now really waking up to the commercial potential Africa has.
From an African perspective, what kind of investors are they looking for?
Well, there are 2 categories. Obviously, the international investor and the local investor. Both are really important for different reasons. International investment at this point is really desperately needed, simply because there isn't enough capital in Africa yet to realize a lot of the opportunity and to sort of invest in a lot of the sectors and areas that need a lot of capital. Also, there isn't human capital is a huge issue across Africa, and international companies, international firms, international businesses, they have international best practice, they have sort of a long-standing track record, and they have a lot of capital that they can deploy in Africa. But that has to go hand in hand with the development of local investment and local entrepreneurs and local businesses, because it doesn't matter how much international investment Africa gets if it doesn't have a well-developed domestic private sector, and it doesn't have people actively investing on the continent, in the continent, it will not lead to development. So, the priority for a lot of governments at the moment is to do the conferencing circuit, to sell the country, to sell their countries, to sell Africa, to sell the story. But a dual priority for them is making sure that private sector development is kick-started, because the two have to work hand in hand.
Conferences like this is obviously made to make more African and Norwegian partners meet each other. What other things is important in order to make to achieve more Norwegian African business cooperation?
Much more exposure is needed. One thing that a lot of Africans will tell you, and it's a good point, is if you want to know about Africa, you have to visit it. So anyone who hasn't yet been really needs to go and see for yourself. I mean, there's no other way to really get a feel for what is happening in a place unless you go there. There's still a lot of educating that needs to be done, and informing. Norway is not alone in that, the business community here, and to some extent the policy environment here, still, isn't quite sure what the new Africa represents, and there's a lot of legacy in policy dating back decades. So the mental and the conceptual understanding of Africa needs to shift, and that's where a lot of work is yet to be done. But that's not a bad thing. I mean, that's just a case of having a receptive audience, and the good thing is that more and more now Africa has a very receptive audience, no matter where it goes, and people are willing to listen. The important thing is they have to be told the true story as well, and this is actually a really critical issue with Africa, in that its potential is not in
From this day that has been interesting.
Well, I must say that our new Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Børge Brende, he made a very clear statement. I mean, that is music in our ears, because he's very pro business in Africa, and there are many points that was raised by him that we can follow up with him as well, because he has made some bold, good statements. And then, of course, the keynote speech with Central Bank Governor Lamidu Sanusi was also great. And I think it's especially important with a country like Nigeria, where we have so many negative perceptions, that we can get people like him to come here and actually break down mental barriers as well.
Naba is working for making more Norwegian businesses invest in Africa. Why should they do that?
They should do that because this is the time to actually position themselves. Norwegian companies have several comparative advantages when it comes to doing business in Africa. We have great health, environment, security standards, good ethical framework for working abroad, and this is the time actually. So I really hope that now, after having now some conferences where we have been kind of giving the message, now it's time to translate this into action and real investments on the ground. And I just hope that Norwegian companies they will jump on the train before it leaves the station. It's about time now.
How can Naba facilitate or help Norwegian businesses who want to know more about investments in Africa?
Well, I mean, we have contacts, network. That's the most important thing, I think, because before you're entering a new country, it's always very useful to have the relevant network. Then we have many good partners who can help with information, what kind of business or investment projects are available, as well as advice on everything from cultural knowledge. How do you behave basically when you're in Angola or in Tanzania, because there is a very different business culture. So we want to be the Norwegian Africa House. No matter what you want to do regarding business in Africa, you can come to us, and if we don't have the answers ourselves, we can at least point you out in the right direction. So companies who are interested in in opportunities in Africa, they should come to us.